In English, I hope you can follow the translation. First of all, this is a very important report from the PISA study. It is our first attempt to assess creative skills. So far, PISA has focused on subject matter, knowledge, and skills. I think it's okay. And with this assessment, we are looking at the capacity of students to think creatively, to solve problems that they have not encountered before in their lives, where they need to deal in unfamiliar situations, think on their feet. Before I introduce the results, just a brief reminder on PISA. You can see a map of the countries taking part on the slide. We had about 500,000 students assessed by PISA. They were randomly selected so that we are sure that they are representing countries in statistically accurate ways. And again, the objective of PISA is not to just look whether students can reproduce what they have learned, but to assess whether they can extrapolate from what they know and use their knowledge in creative ways. And this is very, very important today, because the world economy no longer pays you for what you know. Google knows everything. The world economy pays you for what you can do with what you know, and that makes an important difference. That's the reason for the emphasis. And then we collect a lot of contextual data about the schools in which students are, the parents, and so on, so that we can understand and situate the items. The problem-solving assessment was administered in a subset of countries. 44 of the 65 countries took part. And I congratulate Spain for actually doing this additional piece of PISA, which is really, really important. Let's have a look at some of the results. How do 15-year-olds perform on this test? The first thing, of course, is what does this test measure? Here are a few items. We wanted to see whether students can explore and understand a problem they have not been familiar with, whether they can build a mental representation of the problem. That means really sort of figure out what is behind it, whether they can actually solve the problem, and whether they understand what they solved, reflecting on the solution. Those were the skills being assessed. And here you see the results. You can line up countries on a scale. On top are the countries with very strong performance. Singapore and Korea leading the field. Shanghai, that was very good in mathematics and science and reading, is also good on this assessment, but no longer at the top. So you can see the rank order of countries on this test of creative problem solving is not exactly the same as you are used to it. Countries like England did not do so well on mathematics, but they do really well on this problem solving assessment. And for Spain, the opposite is true. Spanish students do less well than they do in mathematics, and we're going to go through some of the explanations for this. So you can see the position of Spain on this chart overall among the countries that are being compared. Let's look a bit at the top end of the distribution. Very important this day, and I show you why, with some data from our PIAC assessment. We looked at the likelihood of people being in employment by different levels of problem-solving skills. And what we see is that people with very basic levels of problem-solving skills have actually seen a dramatic decline in employment probabilities. So doing so-so on this kind of test is not going to help you in life, because those kind of jobs can easily be digitized, automated, and outsourced and disappear from our labor markets. If you have very low skills, you keep your job. They pay you less and less. You see declining wages, but there are many jobs in our societies that do not require great problem-solving skills. So the red line on the chart is flat. But what is important, the only employment growth in the European area has been for people at the high end of the skill distribution. And this is why these kinds of skills that we test with PISA are so important for success today. Employability depends not on just remembering what you were taught in school, but on your capacity to use your skills to solve problems. A big widening of the gap, those with basic problem-solving skills, seeing fewer jobs, those with advanced skills actually being the winners of this. So, what is the share of students at the high end of the distribution? You can see if you look to Singapore, you have about, or Korea, or Japan, you have between 20 and 25% of students at the top end of the distribution. Those are students with very advanced thinking skills. They can navigate information, they can extrapolate, they can think creatively, and so on. In Spain, it's below 10%. There's a difference between boys and girls. What our data show is that boys are typically better at the highest end of the skill distribution. And in some countries, if you are in Italy, in Slovakia or Croatia, you can actually see that the gap is very wide. Now you have about twice the share of boys being top performers than girls. So there's an important gender gap. I think that is a message for teachers in the classroom to watch out at the high end of the skill distribution, closing those kinds of gaps. At the low end of the performance distribution, these are students who struggle with very simple tasks. You can see that share is about 30% in the case of Spain. A significant share of students having great difficulty solving even the most basic problems. One question is, of course, where does the problem lie? Is it an issue of schools, or is it a question of classrooms or students? And one way to measure this is to look at the variability of problem-solving performance that lies between schools. First of all, we can do this from mathematics. You can see with these triangles the proportion of variability that lies between schools. And you can see actually that is quite small in Spain. You can see the same for social background, and then the blue bar is problem-solving skills. And actually when you look at this chart, you see a very important outcome, and that is that the variability in performance is not simply, some regions not doing well or some schools not doing well. You have actually many students in many classrooms, in many schools, in many regions with big problems, with major problems. It's a very important message here. If you are, for example, in Hungary, you can say, okay, we know where the schools are that have difficulties, we can address them and we solve the problem. In the case of Spain, it's harder. No? The variability does not lie primarily between schools. No. It's about many students in many schools, where you can see actually the results that you've seen. How does problem solving compare with other types of skills? One thing you can do is you can look at how do students do in problem solving compared with mathematics. On the vertical axis you see the score on problem solving, on the horizontal axis the score in mathematics. And this is what you would expect. Students doing well in mathematics will also do well on problem solving. That's sort of your normal assumption. And in some countries it works like this. But there are important exceptions. If you look to the United States or the United Kingdom, you can actually see that students are better in solving problems than they are in mathematics, particularly at the high end of the skill distribution. Students who are very good, who have a good foundation in conceptual understanding in mathematics, are even better on the problem-solving scale. At the low end of the distribution, it's not so much a difference. So England and the United States as examples of countries that have relative strengths in problem-solving. For Japan, Japan is another country that is relatively strong in problem-solving, stronger than in mathematics. But here you can see the advantages mainly with students at the low end of the performance distribution. If you look to Spain, as you could see before, the performance is lower in problem-solving than in mathematics. In particular, and particularly low for students with very basic levels of mathematics. And that is one of the most important messages of this assessment for Spain. It tells us that the instructional environment is still geared too much to the reproduction of subject matter content. Now, students remember what they were taught in the classroom. That's okay. But as soon as they are asked to actually use their knowledge in ways that are unfamiliar to them, to connect the dots where the next issue comes from, to think across subject disciplines, to extrapolate from they know, that's where they struggle, and particularly students who lack the most elementary foundations in mathematics. The gap is quite wide, but at that low end of the distribution. And there are other countries as well. If you go to Poland, Poland is also a country that doesn't do so well in problem solving, compared with mathematics. And then you see Singapore that does exactly as you would expect. So countries vary on this, but for Spain the results are clear. Students struggle with creative problem solving skills even more than they do in subject matter disciplines like mathematics. And this tells us something about the instructional environment in classrooms. It's not an issue of social background, it's not an issue of school factor, it's really something that has to do with what happens in classrooms. Most of the variability is between schools. And here you can see just a summary. On the right side you see countries that do have relative strengths in problem solving. In the middle, you have countries where this is so-so, and then you can see Spain among the countries where the students are relatively weak in creative problem-solving skills. We have also looked at different nuances of problem-solving skills. Some students were better on interactive tasks where they had to interact with the problem. You know, the problem changes when you interact with this. This is a dynamic problem. Other students were better when they could see the whole picture in front of them. We call them static problems. And you can see basically for Spain it does not make so much of a difference, but a little bit students were better on the interactive type of problems. We've also looked at whether students were better in using knowledge as opposed to acquiring knowledge. And there you can see Spain is sort of in the middle of this. And when you put it together, you can see Spain sort of not having particular strengths. Some of the countries are out. You know, you can see, for example, if you see Singapore or Korea, you can see students are better in acquiring knowledge than in using it. But for Spain, those differences are not very pronounced. I want to come back to the issue of equity, the issue of resilience. To what extent can students overcome social disadvantage? And I want to show you one chart which is about mathematics. And I've ordered performance by the deciles of the student socioeconomic context. For example, what you can see here is that the students from very poor families in Mexico do worse than the students from wealthy families in green in Mexico. And there is nothing wrong with the Mexicans. You can see that same picture basically for all of the countries, including Spain. But when you compare it across countries, you can actually see that students from similar social contexts perform quite differently. And I want to show you this. You see Spain highlighted here. And what you can see is that even the most disadvantaged children in Shanghai, children from room cleaners on basic sort of services, outperform the most privileged children in Spain. And this tells us something. This tells you that PISA is not just a socioeconomic story. It's not just that, you know, Spain is not as economically developed as other countries, or the parents are not as wealthy as parents in other countries. Even children from wealthy parents actually, when you compare it across countries, do less well than children from poor countries and some others. And it tells us also that we can actually overcome social background. Social background is something where we can see some countries, despite coming from a disadvantaged background, do quite well. But this chart is a very powerful illustration that we are not talking about the context. We're talking about what happens in that context, in the classroom, in the school. We can compare problem solving in mathematics. This is the impact of social background on the outcomes in problem solving, and this is the impact on mathematics. And we can see actually in the area of mathematics, social background matters more than in problem solving, which tells us that problem solving skills may be also developed outside formal school settings, which are not subject to school as much as mathematics is. We have measured also to what extent students from the quarter of the most disadvantaged socioeconomic context end up being top performers. And you can see in many of the East Asian countries, half or more of the students coming from the most disadvantaged families still end up to be top performers. Spain is in the middle group, and then you have in the red area students where you can say poverty is destiny. But again, you can see that the impact of social background on success of students is very different across countries. Some countries are a lot better than others in addressing social disadvantage. I want to just conclude with a couple of points on the findings. What we have seen is behind education systems doing well on the PISA assessments in general. And I'm ordered the levers by their relative importance, and I keep into account the economic and social cost of reform. Of course, everybody wants to do things that are important and easy to do. Nobody wants to do things that are less important and hard to do. Obviously, education systems try to move into areas that are really difficult to do but very important. And you can always pick up some low-hanging fruits, things that are easy to do but less important. So in this chart, I can sort of highlight some of the areas that we have found to be predicting outcomes. The first thing I want to highlight is that high-performing education systems are typically very good in raising expectation for all children. They have rigorous, focused, and coherent curricula, universal standards for all children, high expectations. And we can see that actually to some extent in the data. You know, when we ask children, what makes you successful in mathematics, for example? Many students in Spain, but many other European countries as well, say, well, you know, this is all about talent. If I'm not born as a genius, then, you know, I study something else. If you look at those results in the, for example, East Asian countries, I just came from Singapore, you know, almost all of the Singaporean students tell you, you know, if I really try hard, if I invest my effort, I trust my teachers are going to help me and I'm going to be successful. So they don't see the education as destiny. They see themselves as owners of their learning process. And you can actually see that in the PISA results. On the horizontal axis, you find an index of self-efficacy, the extent to which students think they can actually overcome difficult problems they haven't seen before. And on the vertical axis, you can see the mathematics outcomes. And there's a strong relationship within countries, but you see that also operating between countries. Students that have higher aspirations, higher expectations, higher sense of self-control actually perform better. The other side of this is, you know, who do students blame when things go wrong? No. This is the average. These are data for Shanghai, and these are data for Spain. Spain is not so different from the OECD average, but you can see there are a lot of students in Spain who blame anybody except themselves. Now you can see they sort of say the course content was too hard, or the teacher didn't explain things well, or any possible reason except sort of their own ownership. And you can see actually when you look at Shanghai, for example, that is much less the case. Students really see themselves as owning their outcomes. And that tells you a lot about their teachers, their schools, which have high expectations for every student and no tolerance for failure. We have generally in high-performing countries again, very rigorous standards, clear instructional systems that translate national examinations into curricula and instruction. Most high-performing education systems have what we call high-stakes exit examinations. They're very clear about what matters to be successful in the education system. And those systems have a high level of metacognitive content. What I mean by this is students do not just repeat what they have learned in school, but they're very, very good to understand the paradigms underlying their subjects. I'm just going to skip that. That's quite familiar here in Spain, I think. The capacity at the point of delivery, you can see high-performing systems being very good in attracting, developing, and retaining great teachers, providing a lot of instructional leadership, and keeping the teaching profession very attractive. Essentially, what you have is career diversity, both horizontally and vertically. Teachers can evolve and develop and grow in their careers in many different ways. Many examples in our studies. Incentives and accountability. We can see that they have typically a good balance between lateral accountability, working with your colleagues, working with other schools, and vertical accountability, being transparent about outcomes. And those incentives operate on students and on the teachers as well. I just want to sort of highlight one aspect on this that is quite important, and that looks at the relative discretion that schools have. This chart shows you on the vertical axis the PISA performance, on the horizontal axis the relative discretion that schools have to shape their instructional environment. And you can see that it's not a very strong, but there is a relationship. Overall, high-performing countries tend to give their schools a lot more responsibilities for shaping their instructional environment. And you can see Spain pretty much to the left, despite the fact that there have been changes strengthening the role of schools, compared internationally, is still not very strong. But school autonomy doesn't work in isolation. We actually see when you look at this, if, for example, school leadership means that it's only the principal who decides, there's no sort of involvement of the profession, you can actually see how school autonomy can work against you. The lower performing schools are the ones that are more autonomous. But if you're in a school system where you have a distributed leadership, where sort of decisions are made in consultation at the school, you can see how school autonomy becomes a very important predictor of success. You can see the same thing, very controversial, I know. If you have a system that is not very transparent, where school results are not discussed, not published, you can actually see that more autonomy works against you. If you do have an education system with a high degree of transparency, you can see how school autonomy becomes a very important predictor of school success. So it's not school autonomy alone, it's the combination of autonomy and a high degree of transparency. Last but not least, if you operate in a system where there is no shared notion of what good performance is, we call this standardized mathematics policy, but basically this is about having a shared notion about good performance. If there is none, you can actually see school autonomy works against you. But if you have a clear understanding across the system of what good performance is, you can actually see how school autonomy works in your favor. And here I just want to contrast the kind of quality assurance systems that are behind education system. If you look to the OECD average, that's the blue bar here, you compare that with, for example, Singapore, that is very, very strong quality assurance, and then you look at Spain. You can see that despite the fact that in Spain there is a national curriculum, the majority of schools do not see themselves as operating within a shared understanding of what good mathematics is. Few schools talk with experts out of their own school about improving performance. Few schools mentor teachers, teachers coming into the school, guiding them to become great on this. More schools do sort of forms of evaluation, but not universal. So you can see overall, Singapore would be an example of a country that has a variety of quality assurance mechanisms. This is not just about tests. This is about many, many aspects. Whereas in Spain, the picture is a bit patchy on that. I think I skipped the remaining factors. What we also see is that high-performing systems are typically very good in attracting the most talented teachers to the most challenging classrooms and schools. Investing resources equitably is a good predictor for equity in outcomes, but also for overall quality in outcomes. It's an area where Spain does not do badly. I mean, Spain distributes the resources at least equally, which is better than many other countries do. And then finally, what we see very clearly is that it's all about coherence. It's about alignment of policies across all aspects of the system. It's about consistency of implementation, and it's about fidelity of implementation. Those are some of the ingredients that we see behind the successes of high-performing education systems here. Overall, the results that you've seen are similar for the results that we have seen earlier, but students tend to be more challenged in problem solving than they are in the subject matter disciplines, and it really tells us about the instructional environment, the importance in Spain for students to learn in more open environments, for teachers to engage with them such that they strengthen what we call competency, the capacity to use and apply knowledge, as opposed to just replicating knowledge that has been given to them. I leave it here. Thank you very much.